Hey, and welcome to our 50th class on the Christian Basics, or for my Lutheran teenagers out there, Confirmation. Every week, we aim to bring you biblical content that will help you in your new and emerging walk with Christ. I'm Evan McClanahan. I'm the pastor at First Lutheran in Houston. And this week, I'm joined again by my friend Taylor Neal of Search Ministries, that is searchnational.org. We're looking at economics, or really what it means to be, to live in a free society. Should we advocate for a free market or something like socialism or communism? What does our Christian faith have to say about things like that? Let's roll. Okay, well, thanks, Taylor, for coming back. This is part of a 4-week look. This is really sort of application of the Christian faith or sort of social issues. And so we're looking at marriage and abortion. We're looking at economics, and then we're looking at good government. And so I wanted to bring you in to kind of talk about economics. There are divergent views of sort of social planning or what kind of economy you should have. And Christians will, in theory, sort of advocate for these different views. I mean, there are Christian socialists, Christian communists, Christian capitalists, etc. I want to take a step back a little bit and to put our cards on the table. We're both going to advocate for free markets. Mm-hmm. You might say open markets, capitalism, generally speaking. Maybe not all the results of capitalism, but generally speaking, capitalism. But what are kind of some basic building blocks that we can, with integrity, right, without abusing Christian scriptures, look at and say, I think these are the things that would tend to lead toward any economy. And I mean, again, no surprise, we're going to end up going toward a free economy. Mm-hmm. But what are the principles that we'd start with?
Well, I think that we can fairly safely deduce from Scripture that every individual is valuable and important to God, right? Okay. So let's kind of just start with that in the back of our mind. And I know that our Christian socialist friends absolutely would affirm that, and they would say that's why we need to do this socialism thing. Mm-hmm. But I think we can dig a little bit deeper than that too. And one of the things that I find in Scripture to be very, very challenging, especially in the words of Jesus, is that there's this expectation of me individually, that I would show charity, that I would help the poor, that I would live generously. And that to me doesn't sit well with the idea of shoving it off on government action. And I don't think that that's a conscious idea that people that would disagree with us might say. And in fact, I think since we're laying our cards on the table, I'll critique my side first. I think that one mistake that Christians who think that capitalism is a better system of government have made the mistake of saying that it's moral. I don't think that's true. I think capitalism is amoral. I don't think it's immoral. I don't think it's moral.
It's just a system.
And
you pile into it your virtues or your vices.
So that's right. So maybe we should define what we mean. And really what I'm talking about is just the freedom of individuals to enter into as many voluntary transactions as possible.
Yeah.
Right. But what that does is it gives us the freedom to sometimes hurt each other. Yeah. And that's why I think, I'm not an anarchist. I think that we do have to kind of regulate the rules of the game. But I think the danger we run into is if we're asking the government to take responsibility for too much, then the government has to look down and start regulating behavior in a way that it's more than just, hey, we're just going to make sure the game is fair. No, we're trying to manipulate outcomes. Yeah. And now that's taking away other people's freedom. Now, if you think of the government as what it is, which is just a collection of individuals, that's people controlling other people. And I do think that clashes with the biblical notion of how we're supposed to live. We don't get to control one another. Yeah. That's why the Constitution was actually set up not to restrict you. The government was set up to the Constitution was set up to restrict the government. Yeah, and that's why there's the explicit rights listed for the people. And by the way, they say if the government doesn't have the authority explicitly in this document, then they don't have the authority to do it, whatever the question is.
Yeah. So let's go back though, because even something like the Constitution is predicated on the belief that human beings have what are called in the Declaration unalienable rights, right? There are these rights that humans possess by virtue of their nature, right? By virtue of their being children of God, not because we evolved the best from, the animal kingdom, not because we have the biggest guns or the biggest muscles, but by virtue of being a human being. And so, why do we think that? Like what is in the Bible or in the Christian theology to say that
this is a great point. I think if we want to understand the biblical case for let's just say liberty and freedom, looking at what the founders wrote is a good place to start, because they really thought very seriously about this. And of course, as you said, they predicated their conclusions on a biblical understanding of who human beings are. They understood that you could not derive value out of a secular system. You can get preferences from that. And this is a little bit technical, but the idea is if human beings are just moist robots, we're a product of evolution, right?
Yeah.
Then it's very hard to look at that and say, well, we ought to behave a certain way. We should do this because we have this intrinsic value. Why do we have intrinsic value if we're nothing more than that?
Yeah.
And so if you do away with that assumption, you kind of do away with the assumption that there's a right way to treat people, and then inevitably that there's a wrong way to treat people.
Yeah.
So the whole idea is based on we are these human beings endowed with unalienable rights by our Creator. The government doesn't give us our rights. The government recognizes the rights we already have.
Yeah.
They exist to protect those rights. They don't give us rights. We already have them. And so if we recognize that, and if we think about that, of course, that has massive implications for how we treat each other, but it also has very important applications for our relationship with our government.
Yeah. So I think a couple of principles. When one thinks about an economic system, you could think about it from like a worker's point of view. You could think about it from a production point of view. So let's give maybe a couple of examples. Let's say somebody, works a full day. Are they entitled to wages, right? What is kind of behind that?
Yeah, I mean, so if we're staying with this idea of the value of persons, then I have the free choice to work for you or not to work for you. So there's this assumption that there's going to be a working out negotiation between you and I.
Yeah.
This is what I'm offering. I'm offering my labor, and in return, you're offering me whatever good or service or monetary compensation for that, and that both sides are agreeing to that voluntary transaction. And by the way, that's a moral transaction.
That is a moral transaction.
Right. Moral transaction. It is moral. And the idea of charity as well operates in a much more kind of moralistic notion. Consider this a parable, I guess. Say, we're both in the desert. We have limited resources. We have one bottle of water between us, right? And I see that Evan's really thirsty. And so I give Evan half of my water. That's a moral transaction, right? I gave of my own good graces, and you received it. And so there's a good chance you're feeling very much gratitude towards me. And that if later on down the road you have half a sandwich, maybe you're going to give me part of that sandwich, and we'll both survive that way. Now contrast that with, say, the president rides in on a camel in the desert. Not sure why he would be there, but in this scenario he is. And he says, Taylor, give Evan half of your water. And, he's got a gun. So I guess, I'm going to give him half of my water. Now, the result is the same. You have half the water. But the moral content of that transaction is completely different now.
Yeah.
I didn't give freely. There's no adulation due to me. You don't feel gratitude because I didn't give freely. As a matter of fact, you're probably sitting there thinking, like, he's had that water this whole time and didn't give it to me until he had to. What else does he have over there that I don't have?
Yeah.
And so this element of compulsion really is what distorts those kinds of transactions. And when you look at other systems of government, I guess that's my main contention, is that this element of compulsion is necessary to make those systems work.
Yeah.
And I think that that's what corrupts it.
And then you see many examples of compelled labor in the Bible that are never positively looked on. For example, the Israelites in Egypt, when the yoke gets harder and harder. And just yesterday we were doing a study on Rehoboam, and he is asked, hey, go easy on the people. This is when the kingdom, right, as it's dividing after King Solomon. And and go easy on the people. He says, oh, you want me to go easy on you? I'm going to make it harder on you, you know? So more taxes, harder work, we're going to whip you, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, the notion of forced labor, and that effectively is, let's just jump the gun here. That effectively is when you look at something like communism, it is. So like in a country like China today, you have people working very hard, and they are some sort of illusions of privacy, but at the end of the day, if the government wants to come in and take whatever you have, there is absolutely nothing that stops them from doing it. You really have no sort of legal rights. You have no claim against the government. And sometimes in America it feels like that too these days, to be honest. But at least we could sue, for example. We have a judicial system, which is another category of rights, but we have a system in which we could say, no, actually this belongs to me. Which, by the way, that gets me to a category or a principle of private property. And that kind of undergirds this, and those are words that we need to say. Many young people today will absorb in school private property is a selfish, bad thing. It really needs to be abolished. In fact, this is not a conspiracy theory, but the World Economic Forum, as you know, said in 2035, I think, this is the Great Reset. It's on their website. You can see it. You will own nothing and be happy, right? So private property as a concept is very, very much globally under attack. So as Christians, if we're going to defend it, are we just greedy people, or is there actually a reason to defend it? And is there a biblical precedent for defending it?
Before I get too far into this, I just want to point out what I think is a massive inconsistency, and that's that, you know, there are these arguments being made, and sometimes very eloquently, that it is selfish to amass tons and tons of wealth for yourself, even if you do it in an ethical way. But it is not selfish for the government, which, again, remember, is just people. Right. Just substitute that in your mind.
So you're a rich guy, that's bad, but we're a rich government, and that's fine. In fact, we can even spend money we don't have.
So it's selfish for you to want to keep your wealth, but it's not selfish for us to want to take it and do what we want with it. There's something wrong with that. Yeah. And I think the biblical citation that I would be most comfortable going to here is the parable of the field workers, right? So this is where one worker shows up at the beginning of the day. He agrees to work for a denarius, and he works
a fair day's wage.
A fair day's wage. He works the full day. Somebody else comes along like halfway through the day, and the field owner makes the same agreement with them, but they only work for half the day. Yeah. Now, when the first guy finds out that this guy came at lunchtime and he got paid the same as me, he's very indignant about
There's even a guy that I think comes and works 1 hour at the end of the day, like the sun is setting, and he gets the denarius in it. So the guys at the front of the line are like, wait a minute.
What happened here? Yeah. And the field worker replies to them, I have not wronged you, friend.
We did what we agreed.
We did what we agreed. Yeah. Do I not have the right to do with my own money what I choose? Yeah. And I think that the lesson that Jesus is trying to teach there, he's rebuking us for our jealousy. We were dealt fairly with. Because we judge that somebody else got more than us is no reason for us to look across at them with envy. And this is something biological in us. I don't know if we have time for this, but like we observe this in other primates as well. Yeah. There's this famous experiment where these two monkeys complete a task for the researchers, is handing them a rock, and then they get a piece of celery or something like that. And they do this over and over and over again. But then like halfway through, they switch out one of the monkeys' celery for grapes, and grapes are much sweeter and tastier. When the other monkey sees this, he's outraged. He goes crazy. He throws the celery at them. Yeah. And before he was perfectly happy to complete the task for celery, but now that he sees that the other guy's getting a grape, and I think this happens to us as well. There's something inside of us that says this is unfair.
Yeah, I think you could have there are rich people who are jealous of richer people, and then there are like super poor people who are jealous of slightly less, slightly more. Yeah, you know what I mean, like less poor people.
And I want to be clear that I'm talking about myself here too. Sure. This is an impulse in me. It's very natural for me to look across the table at somebody who has more than me and just be jealous and think that I deserve what they have.
But within, say, the extremes of communism or the extremes of capitalism, Christian moral theology would say in either case, you do not covet. Do not covet what other people have. That's be content. And so I think that's a corrective maybe to the excesses of people say, greed is good, capitalism produces greed. And we, those are things we agree. We disagree with, right?
Yeah, I do.
Capitalism is a system, right, in which people's greed can run amok.
Yeah, I think I agree with. I think it was Churchill on this. I think I agree with him when he said that capitalism is the worst system except for every other
Yeah.
system.
Yeah.
So, really, it's up to us. That's what I'm trying to get across here, is that the best we can do is live freely with each other, is for me to look at you and say, I want you to live free,
Yeah.
and I want to live free.
Yeah.
Now we have a duty as Christians to be charitable to one another and to help one another, but it's not going to help to bring in a third person to compel us to do what they think is the right thing.
Right. Because that will infringe also on our being image bearers of God and so on and so forth. We talked about two other parables. I just want to quickly mention. One is the parable of the talents, right? So this is where someone gets one, someone gets two, someone gets five, or sometimes it's like 1, 2, and 10, or 1, 5, and 10. But anyway, Jesus tells it a few different ways. But the point is that a wealthy landowner hands out different amounts of money to different people, and he says, "Go invest it," right? And one of the issues we're dealing with right now is this clamor, if you will, for equity. And so we really are having an ideological battle right now in our culture about equity and equality.
Yeah.
What do those words mean, and what does that parable have to say about it?
Yeah, that's a good thing that we should clear up, because I think there's been an awful lot of confusion about the two words equity and equality. And some would look at it and say the confusion is intentional. I'm not putting that forth, but there certainly has been some conflation. Equality is typically thought of as just equality of opportunity. Hey, this is a level playing field. Doors are open to anybody. And, we're not going to have any systematic or governmental preferences for people based on any immutable characteristics. And I think
Immutable meaning their gender,
Can't
their
control-
race,
right, that's
ethnicity, things like that.
correct. And you really, really have to go to the fringes of any ideology today in America to find someone who disagrees with that. Everybody, generally speaking, agrees with this idea of equality. Equity is something very different. Equity is basically equal results. Okay. And so it's, the idea is that I can point to a system that produces unequal results, and that I can infer from that on a single factor analysis that there's something prejudicial about it. So if in school, boys are performing better in STEM, which they aren't anymore, generally speaking, at least not in the high school level, but just say that naturally happened. Well, then, this idea about equity is an unequal outcome. Not only do we need to take steps to make sure it comes out perfectly equal, but there's something sexist about the way that we're doing this. And I think that that's a faulty assumption. There's all kinds of biological reasons why I might say that, but it's not really the point. The difference between men and women is not really the point. The point is that our efforts towards a certain goal individually may be different.
Yeah.
If you've worked really hard to create a podcast and a video series that's going to be impactful for people. If I set up a camera in my living room and tried to do the same thing and didn't get any followers, it wouldn't be fair for me to look at you and say this is unfair, it's unequitable that I don't have a big following.
I promise you to get more followers. Go ahead.
But the idea is I didn't put in as much effort. So, and maybe I'm not saying it's because I'm lazy, but maybe I have other interests that I'm pursuing. And indeed that is the case. So, that's where I think we can go off with this single factor analysis. Inequity must be a result of some kind of oppression. And unfortunately, I think it's a really toxic idea to teach kids.
Yeah, it's very divisive. So I think in general, we talked about the Good Samaritan, which is the story of a man who's robbed, and we talked about it in our class on the parables. But basically, a man is robbed, and two people pass him by, and then a Samaritan who's really sort of a foreigner to this man helps him, and I'll throw out I'll book drop here. It's an older book written by Marvin Olasky called The Tragedy of American Compassion. And he goes through what essentially American charity used to look like, 100, 120 years ago. All of the public institutions, many of them church-driven, to help people. And since then, we have more or less adopted a socialistic government system of redistribution of wealth. And, the poverty rate's about the same. We spent trillions of dollars to fix poverty, and it hasn't really changed. So we think we should respect persons, let them pursue the pursuit of happiness. It's why that's in the Declaration. But we do have an obligation as Christians to help
Yes,
others.
I think that that's the challenge that the parable has for us, is not to wait for somebody else to do this.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I think that we've just kind of breathed it in unintentionally, even as a church, and I'm critical of the church on this note, that now that there's a government program for these things, we're paying our taxes, or maybe, we're going to even, give a portion of our tithing towards an organization that is taking care of it, or towards, whatever government program or something like that. And that is sufficient now.
Yeah.
Now it's not a personal responsibility, it's a collective responsibility.
Yeah.
So if there's a failure, it's not a personal failure, it's a collective failure. I don't have to feel so bad about that.
Yeah.
The team lost, I didn't lose individually.
Yeah.
But I think Jesus is saying to us, no, this is your responsibility as an individual.
Yeah.
And I think we've fallen down a little bit there, and maybe that has helped the kind of collective idea that this is the government's responsibility grow.
Sure. And there's actually a lot of governments giving religious organizations millions or billions of dollars to outsource this, and then they end up controlling that, which is, I think, a real problem too.
Yes, it is.
But generally speaking, what we would say, I think, is that, if you look at America, for example, yes, it was founded on capitalism and a free economy. It's also an extremely generous country, at least historically. And so, that's kind of the balance that we're going for, is that, yes, we argue for freedom on the basis of the worth of the human being, but we're also reminding you that Christians have an obligation to help one another. There's a balance.
Interject something that I just feel like is probably going to come up, especially in the context of, school curriculum today and stuff like that. And that's I just want to be clear about what I'm not saying.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that people who have historically been mistreated in this country just need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. I don't even know how you do that. Like, if I pull my bootstraps, I do a somersault. Okay? I don't know how you pull yourself up I'm not saying that at all.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that some of the disparities today are not influenced by historical racism and historical sexism. In fact, I do believe that. But what I also believe is I believe that all the racism goes on the same side of the ledger. It's all bad. I think that the devil doesn't care who does the hating as long as we hate.
Yeah.
And so I think that we have to resist these notions and these philosophies that tell us it's right for us to think categorically in terms of our race, instead of first thinking of ourselves as image bearers of God.
Yeah, and I really believe the more open a society, the more it benefits everybody.
Yes.
And in fact, the society wasn't really open in the era of course, slavery and, of course, segregation. And so the more open the society, the more we live up to our principles of reflecting and respecting the individual and the worth of the individual, that's a good thing. And everybody will benefit and will be a lot more at peace. And so there's efforts to sort of go back on that. And I think we're seeing a lack of peace as a result.
I think, in fact, one very prominent popularizer of this notion, I won't use his name because I don't want to make it divisive, but he said that the only solution to discrimination in the past is discrimination in the present. I think that's a recipe for disaster for us. And who else didn't believe it? The abolitionists didn't believe that. Frederick Douglass, who's an intellectual hero of mine, he didn't believe that either. Martin Luther King Jr. didn't believe that. He said that they actually quite agreed with the philosophy that the founders laid out, many of whom were against the institution of slavery, by the way, but it was a political reality at the time.
Yeah.
But they said that the founders had issued a promissory note that they had not made good on, and they were calling on the American people and the American government to make good on the promissory note that is laid out in the Declaration and embedded in the Constitution. So in fact, it's not a racist document. It's not a document built on slavery or something like that. It's quite the opposite. It's a good philosophy that was poorly executed for a long time. Yeah. And so, I'm not saying that we perfectly know the answers and the solutions going forward, but I am saying I know what's not going to work. Yeah. And that's what we've tried before. And that's more racism and more hatred and more division. That doesn't work.
Yeah. We're out of time. Taylor, thanks so much for coming in.
Welcome. Glad to be here.
Well, thanks again to Taylor from Search Ministries for joining us as we looked at economics. Searchnational.org is where to go to learn more about that ministry. In the meantime, you can subscribe to this channel, tell other people about it. I'd appreciate it. Email me at christianbasicsclass@gmail.com. Go to flhouston.org for all the worksheets for these videos. And until next time, take care.